The blueprints for the Oakwood Commercial Center had always lived on the heavy oak dining table in my father's house, their edges curling like dry leaves. For 3 years, I had spent my evenings hunched over those fading blue lines, finding ways to modernize the decaying outdoor mall that my parents considered their absolute legacy. I moved back to this rusted industrial valley in Ohio specifically for this. When my wife passed away 4 years ago, leaving me to raise our daughter Gemma alone, my father Elias had called. He told me it was time to come home, to pool our resources, to build something that would last for generations. I was a structural engineer. He was a real estate developer running out of capital and time. It sounded like a lifeline. I didn't realize it was a trap until a rainy Tuesday afternoon, standing in a quiet, carpeted bank office. Gemma was 16, with her mother's sharp eyes and an absolute obsession with urban planning. She wanted to belong to this family with a desperation that broke my heart. After losing her mother, she craved roots. She spent her weekends at the plaza, picking up trash in the parking lot, organizing the maintenance shed, and sketching out landscape redesigns for the empty planters. She wanted my parents to look at her the way they looked at the bronze plaque on the plaza's cornerstone. My father was a man who spoke in terms of yields, equity, and bloodlines. Elias viewed love as a highly regulated commodity. My mother, Helena, was his quiet enforcer, softening his harsh edges with polite smiles while entirely agreeing with his philosophy. Because Gemma was my stepdaughter, legally adopted by me when she was 5, long before her mother's illness, Elias had always maintained a subtle, chilling distance. He never forgot that her DNA didn't originate from his lineage. I had ignored the slights for years, convincing myself it was just a generational divide, a stubborn old man who just needed time to warm up. I was wrong, and my blindness cost us both. The fracture happened on a Sunday evening. We were sitting in my parents' formal living room. I had just presented a massive structural overhaul for the plaza's north wing, a project that would require refinancing but would secure the property's viability for another 30 years. Gemma, vibrating with nervous energy, had compiled the demographic research for the proposal. She leaned forward, pushing her neatly bound folder across the coffee table toward Elias. She started explaining how attracting a hybrid grocery cafe would increase foot traffic for the existing tenants. Elias didn't even open the folder. He placed his heavy hand flat over the cover, silencing her. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a cold, managerial indifference. He said he appreciated her little school project, but they were discussing generational wealth. He looked right into Gemma's eyes and told her that she was a bright girl, but she wasn't actually part of the family tree. He said the Sterling Trust was for biological heirs, and she didn't need to concern herself with the family's legacy because she would never have a stake in it. The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to intervene, to correct him, to soften the blow. Helena just took a sip of her tea and looked out the window. Gemma carefully stood up, her face flushed a deep, painful red, and walked out the front door. I followed her, but not before telling Elias that if Gemma wasn't part of the family, neither was my engineering license, and neither was my labor. Elias just smiled, a thin, patronizing expression. He told me not to be dramatic, that business was business, and I would eventually understand the importance of protecting what was ours. That night, holding a crying teenager in our small rented townhouse, I realized I had sacrificed my career and uprooted our lives for a mirage. I decided right then to sever my professional ties with Elias. I would finish the current structural permits to avoid legal liability, and then we were leaving. But to leave, I needed to untangle the financial knot I had tied myself into. When I first arrived, Elias had asked me to sign on to the plaza's operating accounts as a guarantor, claiming it was a necessary step for succession planning. I had agreed, assuming I was stepping into an eventual partnership. I scheduled a meeting for Tuesday morning with Miles, the commercial loan officer at the regional bank that held the plaza's mortgages. I went in simply to request the paperwork, to remove my name as a guarantor from the operating line of credit. I figured it would be a bureaucratic headache, maybe require Elias to refinance at a worse rate, but I was willing to walk away from everything I had built for them. Miles was a thorough, quiet man in his late 50s. He sat behind a meticulously organized desk, typing my information into his terminal. He asked me to confirm my intent, warning me that removing myself would trigger an immediate review of the plaza's liquidity. I told him I didn't care. I wanted out. I wanted zero financial connection to Elias Sterling. Miles frowned at his screen. He scrolled down, his brow furrowing deeper. He took off his glasses and looked at me with a strange, hesitant expression. He asked if I was entirely sure I wanted to initiate the separation, considering the primary collateral structure. I was confused. I told him the collateral was the plaza itself, the land and my father's primary residence. That was what Elias had always told me. Miles turned his monitor slightly toward me, though I couldn't make sense of the dense financial coding. He took a slow breath and spoke the sentence that fundamentally dismantled my reality. He told me the plaza's operating line wasn't tied to my father's equity anymore. It was entirely collateralized by the custodial trust account ending in 4409. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I knew that account number. It was the life insurance payout and the wrongful death settlement from Gemma's mother. It was nearly $500,000, strictly designated for Gemma's education, her future home, her life. When we moved back to Ohio, Elias had introduced me to his wealth manager, suggesting I park the funds in a high-yield custodial account at this very bank to maximize the interest until Gemma turned 18. I was the sole custodian. Elias had no legal access to it. I asked Miles to print every single document related to that line of credit. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press them flat against the edge of his desk. When Miles handed me the stack of paper, the truth emerged in stark, black ink. 3 years ago, when I was hospitalized for 10 days with severe bacterial pneumonia, drifting in and out of a fever dream, Elias had come to visit me. He had brought a stack of what he called routine tax filings and municipal permit renewals for the plaza. He told me the city would fine us if they weren't signed immediately. I had blindly signed where he pointed, trusting my father while I was struggling to breathe through an oxygen mask. I hadn't signed permits. I had signed a cross-collateralization agreement. Elias had pledged Gemma's entire trust fund to secure a massive line of credit to keep his failing plaza afloat. He had leveraged the future of the girl he refused to call family to save his own legacy. And because he was operating the business at a loss, the bank had put a freeze on the trust. The money was locked. If the plaza defaulted, the bank would take Gemma's money first. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for 2 hours. The rain drummed heavily on the roof. My first instinct was violence, a primal urge to drive to his house and tear the doors off their hinges. But anger wouldn't get the money back. If I confronted Elias directly, if I threatened him, he could quietly liquidate the plaza's few remaining assets, declare bankruptcy under the corporate shell, and leave Gemma's trust to be devoured by the bank. I couldn't just walk away anymore. I had to orchestrate a controlled demolition. I spent the next 3 weeks operating with a terrifying, frozen calm. I went to the plaza every day. I sat in meetings with Elias and Helena. I drank their coffee. I reviewed the contractor bids for the North Wing renovation. Elias seemed pleased, assuming my threat to leave had just been an emotional outburst. He patted my shoulder, telling me I was finally thinking like a Sterling. I smiled back, feeling absolutely nothing but the cold weight of the documents locked in my trunk. My strategy relied on a specific mechanism in the loan agreement I had reviewed with a forensic accountant I hired quietly out of state. The cross-collateralization clause had a vulnerability. Because I was the sole legal custodian of the trust, and because the pledge was made under circumstances that lacked proper notarization, Elias had his own secretary stamp the documents after the fact without me present, I could formally challenge the validity of the pledge. However, doing so would immediately freeze the plaza's operating accounts pending an investigation for commercial fraud. It would instantly trigger a default cascade. I didn't just want the money back. I wanted Elias to watch his legacy dissolve, knowing exactly why it was happening. I waited until the last Friday of the month, the day Elias had scheduled a massive walkthrough with the regional construction firm to sign the contracts for the renovation. He had invited local city council members. He wanted it to be a crowning achievement. An hour before the walkthrough, I walked into the plaza's back management office. Elias was at his desk, adjusting his tie in a small mirror. Helena was organizing catered sandwiches on a folding table. I closed the door behind me and locked it. I placed a thick sealed envelope on his desk. Elias looked at it, then at me, annoyed by the interruption. I told him he needed to cancel the walkthrough. I told him there would be no renovation, no city council photo opportunity, and no legacy. He scoffed, reaching for the envelope. He asked me what kind of childish tantrum I was throwing this time. When he pulled out the documents, I watched his face. I watched the exact moment his arrogance collided with reality. He was looking at a formal notice from the bank's legal department. The notice informed him that the collateral pledge on account 4409 had been formally contested under penalty of fraud. The operating line of credit was suspended, and the bank was initiating immediate receivership of the Oakwood Commercial Center to protect its remaining interests. Helena dropped a stack of napkins. She asked what was happening. Elias couldn't speak. His face was grey, his eyes darting across the legal jargon, looking for the loophole he usually relied on. There wasn't one. He finally looked up at me. His voice was a panicked hiss. He said I was destroying the family. He said the bank would take everything, the plaza, their house, the cars. He demanded to know how I could do this to my own blood. I leaned over his desk, resting my hands right where he had rested his when he dismissed Gemma weeks ago. I kept my voice entirely level. I told him he had funded his arrogance with a dead woman's money, stolen from a child he considered an outsider. I used his exact words. I told him it was just business, just a matter of protecting what was mine. I reminded him that Gemma wasn't part of his family tree, which meant her money wasn't available to water his dying roots. Elias tried to bargain. He promised to sell off the south parcel, to pay the trust back with interest to make Gemma a full partner in the holding company. The desperation was pathetic. He was offering a kingdom he no longer owned to a girl he had already banished. I turned around and unlocked the door. I told him the city council members were waiting outside, and he should probably go tell them why the bank was chaining the front gates. I walked out of the office, out of the plaza, and never went back. The fallout was brutal and public. The bank's investigation revealed years of Elias's financial manipulation. The plaza was seized and auctioned off to a logistics company that bulldozed it to build a distribution warehouse. My parents lost their home and had to move into a small leased apartment on the edge of town. They tried to contact me a dozen times, oscillating between vicious threats of lawsuits and tearful pleas for reconciliation. I changed my number. I filed a police report regarding the forged notary stamp, ensuring a permanent legal wall existed between us. The bank, eager to avoid a massive lawsuit regarding their own oversight of the fraudulent notary, quietly released the hold on Gemma's trust fund in full. It has been 2 years since that Tuesday at the bank. We live in a different state now, closer to the coast. Gemma is a freshman in college studying architecture. She is brilliant, resilient, and fiercely protective of her independence. She knows exactly what happened, and she knows what it cost to secure her future. The betrayal left a scar, a quiet wariness in how we both approach the world. We don't have a large, sprawling family tree to rely on. We don't have a legacy carved into a bronze plaque on a brick building. But yesterday morning, I sat at our small kitchen table, watching Gemma sketch out a design for a community center on a fresh roll of blueprints. The sunlight caught the concentration in her eyes, so much like her mother's. She looked up, slid the drawing toward me, and asked for my engineering opinion. I looked at the solid, well-planned foundations she had drawn. I told her it was perfect. We built our own foundation out of absolute truth, and no one will ever have the power to tear it down. The drive back to our rented townhouse from the bank felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating fog. The windshield wipers violently pushed away the rain, but my vision remained entirely blurred by a cold, radiating panic. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to process the magnitude of the violation. It wasn't just a financial theft. It was a retroactive poisoning of every memory, every smile, and every supportive word my father had offered me during my recovery from pneumonia. He had looked at me, struggling for breath in a hospital bed, and saw nothing but an opportunity to quietly siphon my dead wife's legacy to patch the sinking hull of his own ego. When I walked through our front door, the house was quiet. Gemma was sitting at the kitchen island, her headphones resting around her neck, meticulously shading a cross-section of a steel support beam for her drafting class. She looked up and smiled, a bright, unguarded expression that made my stomach twist into painful knots. She asked how the meeting at the bank went, assuming I had just gone to drop off routine paperwork for the plaza's zoning permits. I forced the muscles in my face to form a calm, relaxed expression. I lied to her. I told her it was just bureaucratic red tape, nothing to worry about. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand trembling so badly I had to grip the edge of the counter to stabilize it. I couldn't tell her. If I told her that the grandfather who had just rejected her had also secretly mortgaged her entire future, it would break her completely. Worse, her justified anger might alert Elias before I had a chance to build a cage he couldn't escape from. That night, after Gemma went to sleep, I sat in the dark living room with a single desk lamp illuminating the photocopies Miles had given me. I needed a professional who existed entirely outside of Elias's sphere of influence in this town. My father was a man who golfed with the local judges, sponsored the police athletic league, and paid for the mayor's re-election fundraisers. If I hired a local attorney, Elias would know about it before the ink on my retainer check was dry. I opened my laptop and contacted a former colleague in Chicago, a structural engineer who frequently worked as an expert witness in commercial liability trials. I asked him for the most ruthless, discreet forensic accountant he knew. By 3 a.m, I had an encrypted email thread going with a man named Arthur Vance, a financial auditor who specialized in unraveling corporate fraud in closely held family businesses. Arthur agreed to take the case on an emergency retainer. Over the next few days, I began quietly smuggling documents out of the plaza's management office. I would arrive at 6 a.m, an hour before Elias's secretary Brenda unlocked the doors. I photographed ledgers, tax filings, and internal memos, uploading everything to a secure server for Arthur to analyze. The psychological toll of those 3 weeks was excruciating. I had to maintain the illusion of the obedient, slightly chastised son. Every Tuesday and Thursday we had mandatory family dinners at my parents' sprawling colonial house. I had to sit across the polished mahogany table from the man who had stolen my daughter's future, eating the food my mother prepared, and listen to him pontificate about the sterling legacy. During one particularly agonizing dinner, Elias poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon and started talking about the upcoming North Wing renovation. He looked at me with a patronizing smirk, complimenting my structural designs. He said I was finally learning how to think in terms of assets, rather than just load-bearing walls. Helena smiled warmly, passing the potatoes, and added that it was so wonderful to see the family working together to secure our rightful place in the community. I looked at my mother, searching her eyes for any flicker of guilt or hesitation. There was none. She knew. I realized it in that exact moment. The way she meticulously avoided discussing the financing, the way she had looked out the window when Elias told Gemma she wasn't part of the family. Helena wasn't just a passive bystander, she was a complicit architect of the illusion. They had rationalized the theft, in their minds, because Gemma wasn't blood, the money left to her by her mother was an unearned windfall that was better utilized saving the real family's estate. I forced myself to smile back. I raised my water glass in a mock toast and agreed with them, saying that securing the future was the only thing that mattered. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated my tongue for the rest of the night. By the end of the second week, Arthur called me on a secure line. He had found the kill switch. The cross-collateralization document Elias had tricked me into signing was technically a binding contract, but its execution was deeply flawed. Because the trust was established across state lines and involved a minor beneficiary, the bank's internal compliance required a highly specific in-person notarization with 2 independent witnesses. Elias hadn't wanted to risk bringing a bank notary to my hospital room. Instead, he had brought the paperwork back to the plaza and instructed Brenda, his loyal secretary of 20 years, to stamp and log it in her notary journal as if she had witnessed my signature in the office. Arthur explained that if we simply filed a lawsuit, Elias would drag it out in civil court for years, draining the trust on legal fees while continuing to operate the plaza. We needed an immediate catastrophic administrative freeze. We needed to target the bank's liability. If I filed a formal affidavit of forgery and perjury against the notary, attaching my hospital admission records, proving I was physically incapacitated in an intensive care unit on the exact date and time Brenda claimed to have witnessed my signature in the commercial office, the bank would be legally terrified. They would be holding a fraudulent lien. To comply with federal banking regulations and protect themselves from a massive damages lawsuit, their risk management department would be forced to instantly suspend the plaza's operating line of credit and lock all associated accounts pending a federal investigation. But setting the trap required absolute precision. I couldn't just submit the affidavit. I had to ensure Elias was in a position where the sudden withdrawal of funds would completely collapse his house of cards. I needed to wait until he was legally bound to the massive construction contracts for the North Wing. Elias was rushing the contractor agreements. He wanted the groundbreaking ceremony to happen before the end of the fiscal quarter to appease the city council. He scheduled a massive walkthrough with the regional construction firm, the architects and local politicians for the last Friday of the month. He was going to sign a multi-million-dollar commitment, relying entirely on the fraudulently secured line of credit to float the initial payments. 3 days before the walkthrough, Elias called me into his office. He slid a thin stack of papers across his desk. He casually mentioned they were just some updated environmental compliance waivers for the new excavation site, asking me to sign them so Brenda could file them with the city. My heart hammered against my ribs. I picked up the pen, pretending to skim the text. Buried on the third page, heavily disguised in legal jargon, was a secondary indemnity clause. It was designed to retroactively validate all previous financial pledges made on behalf of the holding company. He was trying to cover his tracks. He must have sensed a slight shift in my demeanor, or perhaps his own paranoia was catching up with him. I held the pen over the signature line. If I refused to sign, he would know I was onto him. He might scramble the accounts before Arthur could finalize the affidavit with the bank's legal department. I looked up at Elias. He was watching me with the cold, unblinking stare of a predator assessing a slightly injured animal. I didn't blink. I deliberately broke the tip of the pen against the paper, leaving an ink blot. I let out an exasperated sigh, complaining about the cheap office supplies he bought. I grabbed a different pen from his cup and signed a completely illegible fake signature, intentionally omitting my middle initial, which was legally required for my engineering sign-offs. It wouldn't hold up in court, but it would pacify him for the next 72 hours. Elias relaxed, leaning back in his chair. He thanked me, telling me that after the groundbreaking on Friday, everything was going to change for our family. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and looked him dead in the eye. I agreed with him completely. Everything was about to change. Thursday passed in a suspended state of hyper-awareness. I watched Elias make promises to vendors he could no longer afford, and saw Helena order expensive floral arrangements for a celebration that would never happen. At exactly 8 o'clock on Friday morning, while Elias was at his country club having a celebratory breakfast with the mayor, Arthur Vance executed our strike. He electronically filed the affidavit of forgery, my hospital records, and a formal demand letter to the bank's corporate risk management division. The response was violently fast. By 9:30, the bank's legal team had verified the dates of my intensive care admission against Brenda's notary log. The fraud was undeniable, and the bank's exposure was massive. They immediately triggered a total lockdown on the holding company. Every line of credit, every operating account, and every corporate credit card tied to the Oakwood Commercial Center was frozen instantly. At 11 o'clock, the plaza's central atrium was buzzing with activity. The regional construction managers had unrolled massive blueprints on catered tables. Local city council members were drinking coffee, waiting for the formal signing ceremony. Elias stood at the center of it all, his chest puffed out, wearing a bespoke suit and a smile of absolute triumph. Helena was beside him, directing a photographer to capture the exact moment the sterling legacy was secured for another century. I walked through the glass doors carrying nothing but a single sealed envelope that a courier had delivered to my house 30 minutes prior, directly from the bank's legal department. I didn't cause a scene in the atrium. I didn't want a screaming match in front of the politicians. I simply walked up to Elias, placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, and whispered that there was a critical zoning issue we needed to address in his office immediately before he signed the master contract. Annoyed but unwilling to show weakness in front of his audience, he excused himself, flashing a charming smile to the head contractor, and led me down the back hallway. Helena followed closely behind, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. As soon as the heavy oak door of his office clicked shut, Elias turned on me. He demanded to know why I was interrupting the most important moment of his career. I didn't say a word. I just handed him the envelope. He ripped it open, his eyes scanning the heavy bank letterhead. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet concrete. The document formally notified him that the collateral pledge on the trust account had been invalidated due to verified notary fraud. All associated credit lines were suspended, and the bank was initiating immediate receivership proceedings to seize the commercial center and his personal assets to cover the existing debt. Helena snatched the paper from his trembling hands. She read it once, let out a sharp gasp, and dropped into the leather guest chair as if her legs had completely given out. Elias looked up at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. He lunged for his desk phone, aggressively punching in the numbers for his wealth manager, but the call went straight to a generic corporate legal voicemail. He was completely cut off. He stumbled backward, bracing himself against his mahogany desk. His voice was a thin, reedy whisper when he finally spoke. He accused me of destroying our bloodline, of bankrupting my own parents out of spite. He pleaded with me to call the bank, to tell them it was a misunderstanding, promising that he would sell his cars, mortgage the house again, do anything to make the trust whole if I just lifted the freeze so he could sign the construction contracts. It was a pathetic display of a man who realized his entire kingdom was built on stolen dirt. I stepped closer, invading his space, forcing him to look at me. I kept my voice dangerously quiet. I reminded him of the Sunday evening he had humiliated my daughter. I repeated his exact words back to him with chilling precision. I told him that I was simply protecting generational wealth, and since Gemma was not a part of his family tree, her resources were permanently unavailable to water his dead roots. I told him the city council was waiting outside to take pictures of a legacy that no longer existed, and he had exactly 2 minutes to go out there and explain why the checks he was about to sign would violently bounce. I didn't wait for his response. I unlocked the door and walked away, leaving them suffocating in the vacuum of their own ruin. I walked past the catered tables, past the confused politicians, and out into the bright, cold afternoon sun. I got into my car and drove straight to Gemma's high school. I signed her out early, telling the front desk we had a family emergency, though it was actually the exact opposite. It was a rescue. The collapse of Elias Sterling was swift and absolute. Without the fraudulently obtained credit line, the holding company instantly defaulted. The bank seized the Oakwood Commercial Center within 48 hours, eventually auctioning it off to a corporate logistics firm that tore down the decaying storefronts to build a massive, windowless distribution warehouse. Elias and Helena lost their sprawling colonial home to foreclosure and were forced to move into a cramped, leased apartment complex on the industrial side of town. Brenda, the secretary, faced severe legal penalties for the falsified notary stamp and turned state's evidence, testifying to years of Elias's financial manipulations to avoid jail time. Because the fraud was irrefutably documented, the bank quietly released the freeze on Gemma's trust entirely, eager to avoid a devastating lawsuit regarding their own compliance failures. My parents tried to reach me relentlessly for months. The voicemails alternated between venomous threats of legal retribution and sobbing demands for family loyalty. I never answered. I legally changed my phone number, forwarded their physical mail back to the sender, and filed a police report regarding the forged documents to ensure a permanent, impenetrable legal wall remained between us. We packed up our rented townhouse and moved entirely across the country, settling in a quiet coastal city where the air smelled like salt rather than rusted iron and regret. It has been 2 years since I walked out of that management office. The heavy weight of constant vigilance has finally lifted from my shoulders. Gemma is now a freshman in college, thriving in a highly competitive architecture program. She knows exactly what her grandfather did, and she knows exactly what it took to stop him. The experience hardened her, but it didn't break her. Instead of seeking validation from people who view love as a transactional asset, she has learned to trust only the structures she builds herself. Yesterday afternoon, I walked into our new sunlit kitchen. Gemma was sitting at the table, surrounded by drafting paper and rulers. She was sketching a complex foundational plan for a public library, her brow furrowed in deep concentration, looking so incredibly much like her mother. She paused, tapping her pencil against the paper, and called me over to check the load-bearing calculations on her design. I leaned over her shoulder, reviewing the intricate web of support beams and structural anchors she had mapped out. I told her the math was flawless, that the foundation was solid enough to withstand an earthquake. She smiled, rolling up the blueprints with a quiet, confident satisfaction. We didn't need to inherit a legacy built on lies and stolen equity. We had cleared the wreckage, poured our own concrete, and built something that no one would ever be able to take away.
Editor. The story of Oakwood Commercial Center is not only about money, property, or a failing business. At its core, it is a story about family, belonging, trust, and the consequences that happen when power becomes more important than compassion. The infographic presents the emotional and social layers behind the events, showing how a family conflict can become a deep psychological struggle when love is replaced by control and judgment. The story begins with a father and his adopted daughter, Gemma, returning to Ohio with the hope of rebuilding a family legacy. After losing her mother, Gemma is searching for stability and a place where she truly belongs. She invests her time and energy into helping improve the Oakwood Commercial Center, showing creativity, dedication, and a genuine desire to be accepted. However, instead of recognizing her efforts, her grandfather Elias sees family through the limited perspective of bloodline. His belief that genetics determine value creates a painful emotional wound for Gemma, who is rejected despite being legally and emotionally part of the family. This rejection represents one of the strongest psychological conflicts in the story. When harm comes from strangers, people often expect it and create defenses. But when betrayal comes from family members, it can create a deeper form of trauma because the people who should provide safety become the source of pain. Gemma experiences an identity wound, while her father experiences betrayal trauma after discovering that the person he trusted most secretly endangered his daughter's future. The financial aspect of the story reveals another important theme: the connection between money and control. Elias does not simply make a business decision, he uses financial power as a way to protect his own vision of legacy while ignoring the rights and needs of others. By using Gemma's custodial trust fund as collateral, he transforms a resource meant to secure her future into a tool to rescue his failing business. This action demonstrates how financial abuse can occur even inside families, especially when one person believes their goals are more important than another person's well-being. The social dynamics shown in the infographic also reveal the dangers of a family culture built around status, inheritance, and appearances. Elias and Helena prioritize the idea of preserving a name and a legacy over protecting relationships. The silence of Helena becomes significant because refusing to challenge harmful behavior can allow that behavior to continue. The story demonstrates that betrayal is not always caused only by direct actions, sometimes it is also maintained by those who choose not to intervene. The father's response becomes a central lesson in emotional control and resilience. Instead of acting out of anger, he chooses patience, evidence, and strategy. Although he feels intense pain and a desire for immediate revenge, he understands that protecting Gemma requires careful decisions. He seeks outside expertise, investigates the documents, and uses legal systems to challenge the fraudulent agreement. His actions show the difference between impulsive reaction and purposeful protection. The legal conflict represents accountability. The discovery of improper documentation and fraudulent notarization changes the situation from a family disagreement into a serious ethical and legal issue. The father does not destroy the family's business out of revenge, he exposes a system that was built on manipulation and protects the person who was most vulnerable. The ending of the story shows that true foundations are not created by inheritance, wealth, or family names. Gemma eventually continues her passion for architecture, creating designs based on her own vision and determination. Her father also rebuilds his life around honesty and trust instead of a false legacy. Together, they create something stronger than what was lost. The greatest message behind the story is that family is defined by protection, respect, and love rather than genetics alone. A legacy built on manipulation can collapse, but a foundation built on truth, courage, and resilience can survive anything.